All right, we're back. Sorry about that. Bit of a false start. Realized I had the wrong audio input set there. And yeah, but we are good to go now. I should be coming through loud and clear. Once again, my name's Dan Pierce, director of the Heartwood documentary and host of this show, the Heartwood stream series. And so welcome back to another edition. I don't have something new for you today. I had a super busy week working on some other projects, and I am actually going to share some of what I was working on this week. But for the main show today, I'm going to replay one of my previous interviews with Judith Sayers, Dr. Judith Sayers, president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council and former chief of the Hupacasath First Nation. Long-time advocate for old-growth forests in BC and Indigenous rights, a wealth of experience and knowledge advocating for First Nations, and as well as advocating for old-growth forests. And in this conversation, we talk about the interplay between those two very important issues between Indigenous rights and the need to protect old-growth forests. And I'd say that the vast majority of the time, those things are generally in harmony with each other. But, you know, there's some instances where there's some tension between those two goals, and we talk about some of that tension as well. And the reason why I wanted to replay this interview is because A, it was just a great conversation, and B, I didn't feel like it got as much traction as it really deserved. I don't know what happened that week. It was a bit of an anomaly. So I really hope that anyone who missed it the first time gets a chance to watch it now. And of course, it will live on the Facebook page in the video section there. And the other reason why I wanted to replay this interview is because yesterday was actually the 1-year anniversary of the passing of the DRIPA legislation in BC, which is the legislation which enshrined the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into BC law. I believe one of the very first jurisdictions in the world to actually implement UNDRIP as law. It was a momentous occasion, and it's a really important law. It's a really important step, but I think we can all agree that there's a long way to go before that law really starts to be felt, and it's going to take a long time to bring all the rest of BC's laws into compliance with DRIPA. And of course, we've got a new BC NDP cabinet, which just got announced yesterday, which there were some interesting choices there, some notable placements were, well, David Eby is back as the Attorney General. Murray Rankin is going to be the Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Reconciliation. I think that's there's a lot of that could be a good pick. Honestly, I'm gonna have to do a bit more reading on it. That's not what I wanted to talk about today. But my point here is that we're entering into a new government, and now is the time to start holding this new government, the whole new government's feet to the fire to keep their promises, uphold UNDRIP, follow their own laws, and also start taking action on the BC Old Growth Panel recommendations. So looking forward to getting back to that important work. Before I get into this interview with Dr. Judith Sayers, I did want to show something that is going to be that I was working on this week, and that is hopefully going to be in the news a little bit more. One of my side projects is I'm working with the Nuchatlaht Nation, which is located on northern Vancouver Island, about a half hour from Zabalos. And they are moving forwards with a groundbreaking title case against the BC government, in which they're taking the BC government to court to basically get their land back. is the simplest way to put it. Their people, their ancestors have lived on the northern half of Nuu-chah Island for centuries, for millennia potentially. And for at least going back for the last few centuries, they have held on to their hereditary system of governance. And there has been an unbroken line from father to son flowing from the 1700s all the way through to the current day, with the new Tyee of Nuchatlaht, Jordan Michael, who recently took over from his father, Walter Michael, who passed away recently. And they are moving forward with this groundbreaking title case to get their land back. But the BC government lawyers have pulled out every stalling tactic out of the book. They've tried to basically plead in their official pleadings, and we'll get into this. They've basically tried to make the case that Nuchatlaht abandoned their territory, which the Nuchatlaht obviously did not. They're still there, but the title claim area, the area that they are trying to regain control over, it was stolen from them. I mean, that land was expropriated from them, and they have been unable to access and utilize and live in their traditional territory for quite some time. So, but that's all I'm going to say about that. I want to show this new video. We just released a press release today. Basically, our Nuchatlaht released a press release today calling on the new BC cabinet to uphold their UNDRIP commitments and to stop pleading abandonment in court. And I edited a video to go along with this press release. Hopefully we'll see some news stories next week start to come out about this. There's a really great article that you can read in the Narwhal, which came out a day or two ago, so I'll post that in the comments. But I want to share this new short video with you that I just produced for Nuchatlaht Nation to explain this issue of abandonment that the BC government is pleading in court. And here we go. To assert their rightful ownership over their territory on the Nuchatlaht Nation is taking the BC government to court to assert their rightful ownership over their territory on Nuu-chah Island.
We've been here for thousands and thousands of years, and we've proudly owned it, and we proudly managed it.
But BC government lawyers have taken the absurd and disgraceful position in court to abandon their territory.
The government of British Columbia, in the official pleadings in this case, say that they abandoned all that. They didn't abandon their territory. They were forced off their territory. Their land was expropriated without compensation. Their land was stolen from them. That's what happened.
This is an outrageous position being taken by the BC government that could violate its own legislation to uphold the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
It's not just a promise, it's a legislated mandate. It's required that every government official act in compliance with UNDRIP. And it's an appalling thing that the government of British Columbia still abandoned.
Nuchatlaht is calling on Premier Horgan and his new cabinet to reverse this archaic and distasteful position of abandonment and chart a new course in its dealings with First Nations.
We're not just fighting for Nuchatlaht, but we want to show the world that we can manage better, we can enhance better, and there'll be enough for everybody.
The BC government has an opportunity to be on the right side of history and to show that it's serious about building a true nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples.
This is about a particular problem that we can solve. We can solve this problem. We can solve it now with this newly elected government. We can say, okay, do the right thing. Stop pleading abandonment. Do that. That's a good way to start.
All right, and we're back. And yeah, so that was just a quick little 2-minute video about that abandonment issue that we just released through the Friends of Nuchatlaht Facebook page. I'll post that in the comments as well if you want to follow the Chatland Nation's title case as it moves forward through the courts. That hopefully a trial date will be set early in the new year. And yeah, we can and we'll continue to follow that as we go forward. And hopefully, you know, as COVID, you know, hopefully declines over the next year, we can only hope, fingers crossed. When it's safe to, I look forward to getting back up to Nuchatlaht territory again and doing some more filming. Yeah, we're also still fundraising for the Nuchatlaht's title case. So I will post that fundraising link in the comments as well. And yeah, if you can make a donation to their land back fund, that would be very, very helpful. These kinds of court cases can be long, they can be drawn out, and they can be expensive. And so they need all the help that they can get. So donations are very much appreciated. And the other thing that I wanted to say about that, or actually we talk about that a little bit more in my interview with Dr. Sayers. And so I don't think I'm going to rattle on for too much longer here. So I think from here I'm going to move on and begin playing my interview from last month with Dr. Judith Sayers, president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council and former chief of the Hupacasath First Nation, and an expert and practitioner in Indigenous law, Indigenous rights, Indigenous law, and a longtime advocate for old growth forests. So let's go for it. Dr. Judith Sayers, thank you so much for joining me on the Heartwood stream series today.
Sure, I'm glad to do so.
It's my pleasure. Why don't you just start by introducing yourself a little bit for those who don't know you? Tell us a little about your background and where you're coming from, as well as maybe a little bit about your
Okay. Aklama Kekinusuqs, Hupacasath Nuu-chah-nulth. My traditional name come from the Hupacasath people of the larger Nuchatlaht Nation. And my family originates from both Hupacasath, Uqalit, and a lot of other Nuchatlaht communities, as well as Cree from Saskatchewan. And so the Hupacasath territory is located on the west coast of Vancouver Island, is part of the larger Nuchatlaht community on the west coast of Vancouver Island, territory about 232,000 hectares. That we've always used since time immemorial, or Iqmut in our own language. And currently I'm the president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. I'm an adjunct professor at UVic in both the environmental studies and business schools. And yeah, I'm on quite a few boards, the railway on Vancouver Island. I'm on the board of BC Achievement Foundation and BC Ferries. Just got off a few other boards. It was just too much, but yeah, just try and keep busy and my finger in many things.
Yeah, no doubt. I was just sort of doing a little bit more research on you last night and looking at your long list of you know, accomplishments and you know, just things that you've done in the community of First Nations rights and title and advocacy, and it's just absolutely astonishing what you've accomplished in your career so far. Since this is a show about forests and forestry, could you tell me a little bit more about the forests in your territory and what the relationship has been like between Hupacasath people and the forests in your territory, in your Hahuthi?
Okay. So I told you that our territory is about 230,000 hectares. And before the Mamathni, or the people who arrived by boat, came into the Alberni Valley, into our territory, it was largely forested. And many, many, many miles of forests. And we used all parts of the forest, all parts of our territory. We did a lot of seasonal rounds. So we'd move around from different parts of our territory, and depending on where there was fish, and whether there was deer or elk, medicinal plants. So we'd move around, and a lot of what we depended on, especially for medicines and regalia, were in the forests. And a lot of the important areas for spiritual use was in old growth. And there was a lot of old growth in our territories, and there are ecosystems there that could never be replicated. Once those old growth are gone, those ecosystems are gone. And our medicines, our spiritual places, they're great habitat for elk and deer during the winter range for them. And so the forests, of course, was where we gathered, wood for our homes, for our canoes, for our welcoming figures. And, they were very, very important to us. We were very concerned about the forest, and we had forest keepers, and they would go into the forest and look after them. So after a winter storm, for instance, they would go in and they'd clear up any, what's the word for it, any of the trees that had fallen down, and especially falling into the creeks, because you never wanted to stop the fish that went up the streams to stop their travels to spawning grounds. So the Hupacasath territory has 5 species of salmon, including sockeye, chinook, coho, dog, steelhead. And, some like the chinook come from Alaska, come all the way down the west coast, and they come up the Barkley Sound and into the rivers and lakes in our territory. So it's a very important place for us and for the fish. And, the water and the forests are so integrated, you can't separate them. Because, the bears will go, they'll get the fish, take them onto the land, into the forests, and that's what helps nourish the old growth. And there's somewhat of a cycle there. So the forests were so much an important part of our lives and continue to be so. We used to be able to manage them in ways that we thought was important. Not quite so today, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear about what the forests were like pre-contact or pre-colonization, words are used like, oh, they were pristine, they're wild. And that may be true, but that didn't mean that they weren't very highly managed and utilized. But it was done in a way that maintained the forest, that maintained the ecological health. And I think one of the aspects of the legacy of industrial logging is how the loss of old growth has impacted indigenous cultures by the loss of those medicines, the loss of the big trees, the big cedars that are needed for carving and whatnot. Could you speak to what has been the impact of industrial logging on Hupacasath territory and Nuchatlaht territories more broadly over the last century? What has that meant for your people and your culture?
Well, there are some things that, there's so many areas of clear cut in our territory that you can't, it'll take them a long time to grow back. And even if an old growth forest is considered 800 to 900 years and longer, it will never come back the same. When trees go back, their life cycles, the circles are further and further apart. So the quality of the wood is not the same, and it just does take forever. So I had mentioned the old growth forests were home to many animals, eagles in particular, which are very important to us. And so a lot of their habitat has been destroyed. There are times when they might leave up a single eagle tree, but when eagles learn to fly, they usually fly from, like a tree branch to another tree branch, and make their way down, the young eaglets. And you don't see that. And is an eagle supposed to just kind of fly and fall on the ground? And so there's a lot of planning that isn't there anymore. many of our sacred sites have been just wiped out. You know, and these sacred sites have been used by our ancestors since time immemorial, and we don't really talk about those things, you know, to many people, but, you know, they're part of, you know, the logging. And because there wasn't a lot of consultation until the Haida case in 2004, we never had a say in what was going on in the forest. And so we'd go out to our site and it would be logged, or there might be ribboned, and, you know, we try and stop it from happening, but it didn't happen. And so, you know, you go further afield to find some of the medicines that might be there. You know, the further you away from people, the stronger your medicines are. And if they're, you know, they're the undergrowth to these forests, and you take down the trees, and what's left? I mean, it's those kind of medicines have a hard time to thrive. And oftentimes, you know, there might be value for people to go out and, you know, pick ferns or mushrooms or different things for their commercial use. And they just, you know, or Devil's Club, they just take it all. You know, they don't, you know, and us, we'd go out, we, you know, we'd pick a small patch and move on to the next and move on to the next. So we'd always leave enough to come back to, so you never really destroyed, you know, a whole site. So, you know, you just drive out into the territory, into the lands, and you see so much taken. You know, the other impact it has had, of course, is that when mountainsides are clear cut, when you have water, and we get lots of rain, comes down the mountain, they used to kind of meander down through the trees and, you know, make it into the streams, and you have water year round. But once you clear cut it, that water just kind of rushes. It comes right through, because now it ends up in the river, you get flooding, and all of a sudden you don't have water for the length of time, the length of months that we used to, you know, which can affect water flows for fishing. It can affect our sacred pools that we might use, because there's no longer water there year round. There's just so many things, you know, within the forests that we value that are now gone. And yeah, I'm watching so-called modern logging day practices. It has not been good for our people. And like I said, we don't have a say in that. We, you know, before the Haida case at the Supreme Court of Canada, we never had a say. And even though we might have a say, the district manager can still approve cutting of our forests. You know, one area that's very valuable to Hupacasath is the Mint Valley. And BC Timber Sales has come in and clear cut many, many, many areas, you know, and what's left? That's what we keep on saying. And it's just shocking and devastating to go into a forested area where you didn't know was being logged and find the devastation there. And, you know, and it's, you know, if you're really in tune, you can just feel the sadness. You can just, you know, it feels like, you know, Mother Earth is crying. It's just, it's a really hard thing to witness, because, you know, the BC government and logging companies think it's so much more important to make money. And they think that because you can replant, it's, you know, it'll come back. But it doesn't come back the same way. It takes a long time to come back. And like I said, there's less value in it.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift gears slightly. Can you talk a little bit about the hereditary governance structure in Nuu-chah-nulth culture? Because it's, from what I've learned at least, it's really at the foundation of how Nuu-chah-nulth territories are managed, with clear boundaries and laws. Can you just describe how the system works and why it's been so effective over so many years in meeting people's needs and at the same time protecting the ecosystems that sustain people?
Yeah, so, you know, we, prior to the white man arriving, or the people came by boats, we had our own governance systems in place. and we had our own chiefs, or Hakwea in our language. And the Hakwea each had a territory. And within that territory, it was their job to manage the land, to take care of the people. And so there were various roles. I told you about the forest keeper, but there were river keepers. There were just different roles that people had to play in order to help the chief look after his territory. So the chief would be also responsible for looking after any widows or disabled people, and making sure that they had enough food to live on. And so it was really important. So if someone came into your territory and said, hey, I need to go out and get an elk or a deer or do some fishing, the chief would take a certain portion of that. And some people might call it tax, but that he would take a portion of that and he'd give it to people in his village that needed it. So the hereditary chief had a really big responsibility in looking after the territory, looking after the people, and making sure that the laws and protocols were implemented and done properly. So they had a really, really big role, in governance that we don't today. And of course, when the Indian Act was imposed, some First Nations went to the elected systems, but that didn't mean the hereditary systems disappeared. And today you have some that work really well together, the elected chief and council and the hereditary system. And, in some communities, Nuu-chah-nulth communities, nations were amalgamated. And so like in Hupacasath, there were 3 chiefs, and usually, the chief that had the largest land holding or people became the ta'i, the head chief, and then there was a second and third chief. So there was different placements. Somewhere like Hued, I believe they have 8, and other communities have 10 and 11 chiefs, and so they come together. So like right now up in Nuchatlaht around the Gold River, it's the hereditary chief and 4 other of his sub-chiefs that run the government there. They're one of the few that does. Or somebody like Nuchatlaht has never had an elected chief, and neither has Tokwat. So it kind of varies through the Nuu-chah-nulth territories as to the hereditary system. But in the hereditary system, the chiefs to be very careful about their territories and ensuring that they were well managed. And, we never thought about climate change and environmental standards. It was just how you maintained the territory. You maintained it at a high standard so that you would always be able to look after your chief, your people for generations to come. And so whoever stepped into those shoes would continue on keeping up those values and keeping up the territory. And so, when the Forest Act and other laws came into place that did away with that, they also did away with any authority the chief and council had, and so provincial laws prevailed. And so today we find ourselves, in territories that have been, ravaged by logging and logging practices. And so much was taken through the years that there's not a lot left. And so trying to protect and keep in place what you can is really important. So when I was put in place a cedar strategy, and we determined what our needs were, for housing and culture and our carving, and so we set different areas aside in our territory that nobody could ever touch. And that was kind of what we tried to do to maintain that cedar, but it, wasn't always our say in the end that did it. We have another nation has said that it's their territory, and so then they try and come and take what we protected. And so, there's flaws in all of these systems, but you kind of do what you can do within the system to protect what's important to you. And, forests, and especially old growth, are just so important and integral to our culture.
Mm-hmm. Hupacasath territory was included in the ENN land grant in the 1860s.
Yes.
which has also come to be known as the Great Land Grab of Vancouver Island, which privatized about a fifth of Vancouver Island on southeastern Vancouver Island around the corridor of the ENN Railway. Could you just pick it up and tell the story of this mass privatization of Indigenous territories, which has now come to be owned by Island Timberlands and Timber West, two big logging companies, and just what that privatization has meant for Hupacasath people?
Yeah, so like you said, the government was interested in getting a railway all across Canada, and that included Vancouver Island. I think it's more like a third of Vancouver Island was taken, and much more so in South Island. And so a lot of the nations down there have very little land, and when they go to land claims and trying to get land set aside, all of it has been privatized, and it's very hard to find crown land to do that. In Hupacasath territory, it takes about a third of our territory, so it kind of slices it. And so the east side is ENN, what was an ENN land grant. And so, of course, when you're looking at huge areas like that, a railway didn't need that kind of land, but that was what they gave them, right? Instead of just a strip, down the island that could build a rail. So when the ENN and other owners afterwards wanted to get rid of some of that land, they sold it. And, like the big logging companies used to be Island Timberlands and what was the other
Timber
railway?
West was the other one.
Timber West,
Yeah.
yes. And they had these huge tracts of land. And I always remember one of my elders talking to me, and he'd say to me, he says, they've taken everything. Next thing you know, they're going to take the mountaintops, but they already have. I mean, like they own, all the way to the top. And you see them, using helicopters, heli logging, and taking all those trees. And originally, way back in the Forest Act, when you wanted a tree farm, you go to the government and you say, hey, we want this land for a tree farm. And they would give you more points if you added private lands on. So both Timber West and Island Timberlands added on their private lands. And some of that before them, it was actually Macmillan Bloedel, and then they sold. And so they brought in their private lands as part of their TFL. So a lot of Hupacasath territory and many other First Nations on the island were under Tree Farm License 44. And so in the private lands, they wouldn't have to pay stumpage, but they had to live under the Forest Act and the higher regulations. And of course, through the years, they lobbied and lobbied. The government said that this is our private lands, we shouldn't have to do this. And they got the government to agree to delete their private lands from the tree farm. And we were very, very upset. As Hupacasath, we took the government to court and saying, you can't do that. You didn't consult with us. And the court agreed. They actually agreed that even though this was private lands, we should have been consulted. And they even appealed that, and we won the appeal. Well, actually, they told us to go and consult for 2 years. And if we couldn't get anything done, we had to go back to court, which is what we did. And in the end, we, even though we won, but there had been a transfer from M&B to Brookfield, or I don't even know how that all went. Remember how that all went. But we really didn't get the say in the land that we wanted, which is what we, because we used to work with Macmillan Bloedel, and we'd tell them, no, you can't log there, or, we need to change this or do something like that. And so we were able to preserve what was important to us mostly. It still had to go to the district manager for final approval, but we at least had a say. But now we have none whatsoever. And, sometimes they lock their gates. And so, we might want to go access. There's a mineral that we need for one of our ceremonies, and it's only in one of our mountains. We can't even get there sometimes because they lock us off. I know one summer my father passed on, and I needed to go get some branches from one of the trees, a specific tree, and I knew where to get it, but they had everything locked off because it was summer and they were logging. but they wouldn't let us go in and gather something simple. I said, give us an hour, we'll be in and out, we know what we're doing. And they wouldn't. And so that's the kind of issues that we have is, we can't always go access our sacred sites, if they've got the, roads cut off. And it's been very, very difficult. And so they also, at times Timber West came to me and said, would you like to buy land? We were a poor First Nation, loved to buy the land, but where do we get the money to do that, from them? And, because they seriously wanted to pass it on to the First Nation, but it just, just wasn't possible. I mean, we did buy, there was a roadway into one of our reserves, and they sold that roadway to us, which was also a good thing. But even raising $25,000 for that was, a bit of a challenge when you don't have a lot of the resources you need. So the ENN land grant had a huge impact on us. And, they cut there's just kind of a straight line through our territory. And part of it is in Great Central Lake. So the lake bottoms belong to the logging companies. And one year they wanted to go in and, because, they raised that lake 12 to 20 feet so that they could, when the pulp mill used to put their pollution into the Barkley Sound, into the inlet, Alberni Inlet, they would have a dam that they would open up so it would dilute what they were polluting with. And anyway, so they raised the lake. And so there was all kinds of trees in there, and some company wanted to come in and take the trees off the bottom of the lake and sell them. And we had no say over it because it was private land. But we knew if they took all those tree stumps out of that area of the lake, they would disturb so much salmon habitat. Anyway, we finally managed to stop that from going on, but it was a huge challenge. And the privatization, I mean, nobody owns the bottoms of lakes and rivers. They just don't do that. But because it's part of the ENN land grant, they were able to do it. So it's complicated, many issues in our territories, but the courts did say that we still have Aboriginal title on those lands. And so that still is something that we have to resolve, and why we tell private landowners, there's still Aboriginal title on your lands, and we really need to resolve this. Kind of scary for them, but it's something that the courts have said.
That actually segues really nicely into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the broader issue of Aboriginal rights and title in BC.
Yes.
And could you talk a little bit about just the burden on First Nations to have to prove their rights and title in court? And, what's it been like having to deal with the BC government and the federal government in litigating these matters?
Oh, BC is one of the most litigious provinces in Canada. We've had to be in court for many, many things. And part of that is because there were no treaties in British Columbia other than northeastern BC, where there's a piece of Treaty 8. And then, of course, we got the early Douglas treaties on South Vancouver Island. And of course, now we have modern day treaties. But so there's been nothing really established. And so every time we turn around, we got to go to court to determine what is an Aboriginal right. I mean, for us, it was our way of life, right? We lived on this land. We used every part of it. We fished and we hunted, we gathered. And all of a sudden, someone comes and asserts themselves over us and asserts their sovereignty and says they've got the say. And, and so then we start talking about this is our right to the land as opposed to our way of life, which is a bit frustrating, but it was the only way we could assert what was important to us, just simply going out and getting fish. And of course, we would use our whole territory. And then they established reserves in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because they wanted to confine us to a small land base. Many of us on the west coast of Vancouver Island were given very small land bases because they said, oh, you get your living and you do most of your stuff on the rivers and oceans. We don't need to give you any land. You're not farmers like some of these other places. And so we have very, very small land bases. Hupacasath, we have 5 reserves, which total 232 hectares of land. 5 reserves, 3 are unusable, and very small. And then they stopped us accessing the rivers and the oceans for our food, and so we really struggle on Vancouver Island, on the coast, because we all have such small land bases. And so you can't exercise your rights very well on your reserve. You got to go out into the territories. You got to do what you need. So every time you turn around, you're having to go to court, even to catch our fish, you know, because there was a sparrow case, which we had to fight to say that we had access to fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes. To today, while we're waiting almost 2 years for the Court of Appeal to confirm a case on commercial rights and our right to commercial fishery, because we've always accessed the ocean and sold our fish, traded our fish, you know, and then we're told we're only allowed to have it for food. And so we're still fighting that battle. And, you know, it's really difficult when you have to spend your whole lives fighting. And I think about that all the time. Why am I always fighting the government? And, you know, I'd rather be spending all this energy and implementing things and being able to do that, you know, instead of, you know, having to fight with the lumber company to go on our own land where we have title, to pick medicines, or to, you know, take even firewood, you know, and then they want to make us go out and get a license to get firewood. And it's like, this is our land, this is our territory. And, you know, one fellow even went and challenged the government because he was gathering wood for his house. And he had to go to a tribunal, and then that went on to court. You know, we know this land belongs to us. We know that we've been here since time immemorial, and we know that we have the right to the resources. We fought hard to try and get into the Constitution when Trudeau brought it home in 1982. I was part of that battle too. But you know, of course, it wasn't exactly what we wanted. And we ended up with Section 35 and them adding in existing Aboriginal rights. So the right had to be existing as of 1982, which kind of limited us. So every time you turn around and try and get something good, it doesn't always work the way you want it to, because, you know, in the end, it's not our government. And, you know, one of the things that has always killed me in the way of proving Aboriginal title is that it's up to us to prove our title. And it's our land. They came in and took our land. They stole our land. They didn't beat us anymore. They didn't, you know, in our ears, they didn't sign a treaty. They didn't discover us because we were here. And, you know, terra nullius, which means the land is barren, doesn't apply to us because we were here and it wasn't barren. So there was no legal method that they took our land. But the courts have said, yes, they came in, they asserted their sovereignty. You know, and what does that really mean? How can they assert their sovereignty over us? And so that was one of the things that really disturbed me in the Truth and Reconciliation, one of the calls to action, because they kind of acknowledge that that's the way it is. And they shouldn't have, you know, it should be up to the government to proving their right to our lands. So, you know, every time we turn around, we have to prove our right. We have to prove that we belong here. Even, you know, when we were doing the TFL deletion case, we had to talk about our sacred site, which is something that we don't normally talk about. But in order to prove our connection to the land, that was one of the things that we had to do. So that wasn't easy to do. And, you know, of course, we only told the court a certain part of it. But, you know, like traditionally, I would never tell anybody where a sacred site was. Because it was that important to us. I mean, you know, you use the site, you use branches to make sure there's no footsteps, that no one knew you were there. Yeah, so Aboriginal rights and title have been a long fight in British Columbia. The right to self-government, and do we have that right? You know, Gordon Campbell in the Niska case brought that challenge that there's no such thing and they can't do it. Of course, he lost that case, and Niska went on to finish their treaty that they now live under. and other First Nations have done the same thing. So it's never, and so in 1982, they decided that, okay, enough is enough. Let's sit down and let's negotiate these treaties in British Columbia. And today, what do we have? 5, 6 in the modern treaty day process. And it hasn't been much because the governments want to say, okay, I know Mike Hart was famous for saying you get 5% of your territories and that's it. Out of 95% of your territory, you're allowed to have a small amount of land. People have gone to court. Of course, the Chilcotin got 5% of their land declared to be Aboriginal title lands, and they're still negotiating with BC of what that means. It's been 6 years, 7 years, and we still don't know what that means. And so you continue to do whatever you can to assert your rights and title. And of course, come along the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights, which says that we can own, manage, and use the lands that we've used traditionally. And, although that has now been accepted and Prime Minister Trudeau has promised legislation federally to implement UNDRIP, we haven't got there. In British Columbia, they've passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which is supposed to implement UNDRIP and get all our laws in line with UNDRIP, which would mean we have the right to development, the right to stop development, the right to own our lands, the right to have compensation, restitution of our lands. And we're getting nowhere with that. And so, of course, it hasn't been quite a year, but they're just not implementing what they say they're going to. And so that's very, very difficult when we have our own right of self-determination under which means we can politically self-define ourselves, because they're always trying to make us go into these groups and say that you belong to this group and you have to work with this group. Simple things like that. It's a continual battle, and I had really hoped, when I was young and started working on the treaty process, I was really hoping that in my lifetime, in a short period of time, maybe 10 years, we'd have a treaty and my children would be implementing the treaty and, living from the rights and benefits of that. And yet now they become the warriors. They're the ones that are out there fighting it.
Mm-hmm. I've been actually working with Nuchatlaht a little bit, producing some fundraising videos for their title and rights court case. And I've heard a little bit about what they're going through in court from Jack Woodward, their attorney. And
yes.
he was in court the day that the DRIPA Act passed. And at the same time, BC lawyers were pleading that Nuchatlaht had abandoned their territory and that was the position that they were taking. Have you followed the Nuchatlaht case at all? And are you able to speak to the significance of their title case?
Well, Nuchatlaht is one of our 14 Nuu-chah-nulth nations. And Nuchatlaht is one of those nations that have always had a hereditary chief, a Heartwood, never, elected a chief. And so I think that is, really strong, for their case, that they've always had the same governance throughout the years, that they've never accepted Canadian law. And so they were in the treaty process. We all were, we all had hopes and dreams that this would happen. And we realized it wasn't going to happen in the way we wanted, what we wanted. And so Nuchatlaht went to court, a small nation on its own, and went to court for title. And BC has been raising every possible barrier to stop them from proceeding to that title case. Which is just unreal when you think about it. I've been in a few meetings with them, with the Attorney General, trying to say what's going on here, and why is this happening, you know, we have DRIPA that should be recognizing this title, but like we said, we just, you know, even though they put this law in place, they're not living up to it, which is so unfortunate. I don't know all the details, but, you know, I've tried to help them politically to just get their case into court, and they're trying to do things a bit differently because, you know, Chilcotin took, I can't remember how many days in court, over 300 anyway. And it's such a long, onerous process to go through. And so they've been trying to come at this differently, but still come out with the same ruling that they have Aboriginal title in their territories. If you ever go up into Nuchatlaht, you know, their hills have been stripped. It's amazing how much timber has been taken out of there, and that affects their fishery. And, you know, like one of the neat things about Nuchatlaht is that there was a stream, a fish-bearing stream, a rich fish-bearing stream that belonged only to the chief, to Walter Michael, and before him Albin, and before him his father. And, you know, these are strong evidence of title. And so it's really exciting to watch Nuchatlaht in that battle and trying to find all that evidence that they need to prove the use of their territories, how much they use it. They haven't given up anything. But, you know, I mean, the fact that there's development there doesn't mean we gave up anything. It's just that we couldn't continue to practice on that piece of land the way we used to because of colonization and because of, you know, the money has become more important, you know, and we know that we can manage things a lot better in our territories, you know, that would be better for climate change, better for the environment, that will sustain the land for many generations to come because of the way it goes. You know, there's not going to be much left for the 7 generations down the road.
Yeah, and I will post in the comments the fundraising page for the Nuchatlaht title case and the videos that we produced. And I'm also hoping to get Archie Little on this show in the near future to get him talk about it as well. Moving on. So recently, the BC government, over the last year or so, did a public input process about old growth policy in BC. That panel came back and released a report very recently, which spoke to the need for a paradigm shift in the way that we manage old growth in BC. And the BC government reacted by implementing some logging deferral areas in various places across the province, one of which was in Clayoquot Sound in Nuu-chah-nulth territory. At the same time, or in reaction to that, some First Nations were concerned that the BC government had not adequately consulted them on this process. So could you just react to that report if you read it, but more importantly, the Clayoquot Sound logging deferrals and just your thoughts on the consultation process?
Okay, you know, forestry has always been a volatile issue in British Columbia due to the amount of it and the fact that it was usually these big corporations. It wasn't until, I don't know, maybe the last 20 years that First Nations have really had a toehold into the industry. And some have accepted forest license, some have accepted woodlots. And, you know, I know Hupacasath, we have a woodlot, and we incorporated higher standards, much higher standards than in the Forest Act. And we've long been concerned about what's been going on in the forestry, the impact on fishery, the impact on the environment and the water. And, you know, we've been, you know, and in fact, in the early days before the NDP was the government, Minister Scott Fraser, who's no longer minister, but he was one of our biggest champions for proper logging. You know, everybody knows the history of what happened in Clayoquot Sound. And, you know, the big fight that went on out there, and to be able to have higher logging practices and the higher standards that they have out there because of it. And, you know, there's a lot of forest companies that left the area because they couldn't live up to those standards. And so, we've been trying to work with the government to stop logging, such as the Nuu and, from the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council, we've been asking for shared management or joint decision making to manage the forests so that we would have the same say as the government did. And of course, nothing. And, under the new Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, there is a mechanism in there for you to negotiate joint decision making or consent before decisions. And this government has not started to do so, even though we've asked. And basically, Minister of Forest is saying we don't have a mandate. So I went to appear before this committee that was put together to look at logging and old growth in British Columbia. And I brought that up, that look, we can do joint decision making. There's a mechanism, a legal mechanism now. We need to do this, and went through the declaration on all of the areas that the government has to start living up to. The biggest thing that the Nuu-chah-nulth nations have been saying is they want to manage their own forests. They want to be able to say if old growth is taken or how much of it is taken, and just having that total control over their areas and using higher logging standards than anybody has anywhere else. And so that's kind of what, and so that was voluntary to get these two gentlemen to come into your territories. And so I gathered up as many interested Nuu-chah-nulth, and we sat and we talked to them for a couple of hours. It's not the kind of the real conversations that you need to have and sit down and talk about, on the ground, basic kind of management practices that you'd like to. But at the same time, you don't want to stop the conversation, and the government is putting this process in place, and you need to take a part of it, even though it's not the consultation that you want. And of course, the report comes out, and there's some recommendations in there that the government may or may not implement. And they set aside 51 trees, in British Columbia, I believe it was 51. And then these areas of set-asides, like you said, but I don't know how they got to that point. I don't know. They didn't, and as president of the Tribal Council, they don't come to me anyway. They go to each of the First Nations, and obviously they went to Clayoquot Sound. But I don't think they went to Hupacasath and said, hey, is there any area you want to set aside? I don't know how they chose those areas. And, in that fact, I don't think people were consulted fully, and was it was their priorities, their ideas, their wanting to do those kinds of things. So I don't blame people for saying that we weren't properly consulted. It was just one of those groups that go around the province, collect, from people ideas, and they bring up recommendations. And it may not be as comprehensive. And if you look at what the goal of the government or the responsibility of the government is, that they need to go to every First Nation and talk to them. And in my opinion, they now need their consent, a free, prior, and informed consent, as opposed to, just this consultation and these groups. So I don't blame First Nations for saying it's not the right thing, because, our forests are so key to us, and the issues we've had with forest fires and beetlewood and so many things. It's very frustrating as First Nations to see the government have these same approaches over and over again. It's somewhat of that systemic racism that we see, that they think that's how to find the answers, instead of sitting down with First Nations saying, okay, we have problems, how do we fix them?
Yeah. Just sort of circling back to, staying in Clayoquot Sound for a little bit longer. The nations of Clayoquot Sound, Taloquiet, Ahousaht, Heshquiet, to my knowledge, have really been at the forefront of Indigenous-led forest conservation initiatives and land use planning. I've read the Ahousaht land use plan, and it's very exciting and inspiring. Can you just talk a little bit more about sort of the progress that's been made in Clayoquot Sound and elsewhere in Nuu-chah-nulth territories towards developing Indigenous-made land use planning and conservation areas such as tribal parks and salmon forests. Could you talk about that, some of those projects?
Yeah, I can. It's amazing. I mean, it's a huge area, but with what happened in Clayoquot Sound, nations knew that they had to get organized, and putting land use plans in place was key and important. We did the same thing in Hupacasath, and the government just told us it was a consultation document. They didn't make it a land use plan, even though they did Vancouver Island land use plan. They didn't really talk to First Nations about that. I know we did put in a submission about 40 pages, but nothing was ever taken into consideration in Violet. And so, it was our way of saying, hey, we know our territory like the back of our hands. We utilize it. We know where the important things are. We know where bear dens are, wolf dens. We know the migratory paths of elk. We need to manage this territory. We need to, set aside this old growth areas. And so people put in place land use plans. And so, the three nations in the north, the Nuchatlaht, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and the Hupacasath, have decided to implement what they're calling salmon managed forests areas. And so they want to have the forests managed in their territories according to the salmon. And this has never been done before. And so we're pulling together our own laws that are there. We just have to gather up all the information we can and start enforcing them and working with government to set aside. So, it's not that the government's not too, they're not impressed, but they say immediately, okay, well, that means we're going to have to take some of the area out of the tree farm license. And so we'll have to compensate forest companies. That's the first thing they think about. Instead of saying, hey, this is great. I mean, we can start looking after the land better, environmental standards are going to be better. And so that's going to be some time. But I think it's something that's worth fighting for. And, these three nations that are leading this are also working with Coast Environmental Law and pulling together these laws and just finding ways forward with it. And other First Nations, such as Hupacasath, is buying up all of Tree Farm License 44, partnering with the company there, Western Forest Products. And so and that's going to be their way of dealing with managing their own forest. If we own it, we can do what we want. But of course, as you know, when you get a license from the government, you're expected to cut so much wood and, do certain things that may be contrary to how Hupacasath wants to manage it. So I think all of our Nuu-chah-nulth nations are trying to do what they can. I mean, when Clayoquot Sound wanted no more of their old growth taken, that's when they rose up. We got a lot of supporters, and I mean, that's a very famous story. And so everybody else is doing something that we can. As Hupacasath, we fought the deletion of TFL 44. And so people are, and of course, they're doing what they want to do for their own territories, which is really important and needs to be continued. Because this is our land, and we're trying to assert our stewardship that we've always had for the land, and ensuring that the forests are taken care of is just fundamental to all of that.
Mm-hmm. I've got two questions left for you, if you don't mind. Okay. I want to touch briefly on the climate crisis, because I just feel like no conversation about forestry or really anything else these days is complete without touching on the realities of climate change that we are facing now, not just in the future, but now. Could you speak to how climate change is already starting to manifest itself in Nuu-chah-nulth territories, like what you're already seeing in terms of impacts, and what role do you feel forests will play in fortifying ourselves and mitigating the worst effects of climate change, as well as combating climate change?
Yeah. So due to logging practices, temperatures have risen anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees where there's clear cuts. You know, we all know the famous Cathedral Grove as you drive into Port Alberni. And you used to be able to drive from Port Alberni, go into Cathedral Grove, and it'd be 10 degrees less easily. Now it's 3 or 4 degrees because they've taken out so much of those old trees around the park. And it's really noticeable. So you can see that anywhere in Nuchatlaht territories that temperatures have risen. And of course, that's global warming. But it's also because we've taken away the forest cover and the undergrowth. And so it's gone and it increases. On the flip side of that, droughts, you know, we get, you know, the droughts are really, really, really hard on the trees. And so, you know, there are root rot. Anyway, and so the stability of the trees isn't there. So you get the winds in the winter and they're falling over. Also, you know, we just get so many more wet days. And so when the trees, I mean, you just see them, those big trees, and they're surrounded by puddles of water. And again, that's rotting the roots. And the stability of those beautiful old trees, you know, any kind of trees is hard on them. So, you know, the lifespan of trees is going to change. And, you know, we might just be losing trees just from that alone. And, you know, trying to get carbon sinks and carbon credits instead of taking our trees has also been a really long battle. I know one negotiation we had, we were trying to say, well, you know, we want carbon credits. And they're saying, we don't have those in place yet. I said, we know, but let's negotiate them. And if it happens, then we get the credits. If it don't, it's our loss. But the governments wouldn't do that. So just watching the change in temperatures, you know, and we're just getting greater winds, and so more trees are going down. And part of the growing winds, of course, is that they're taking down the trees, and those that are left standing aren't wind firm. And so we're not doing things properly so that we can get those trees stronger with the wind. You know, we should be able to, you know, if we're looking for solutions to climate change, we need to have that forest cover. We need to have them to help us to take down the temperature as we move forward. I think that's going to be a really key role. And I don't really think that when people are managing forests that they're thinking about climate change. They're thinking more about money and the stumpage the government's going to get, and you know what they're going to sell that for. Sending it overseas and selling raw logs is, you know, happens in our territory all the time. Seeing those big ships leaving the Alberni harbor and, you know, full of raw logs. And, you know, it just, you know, it really devastates me to see that, because you know what they used to be, you know, and what role they played, you know, within our territory. So I don't know, there's so many issues, I think, with climate change that we haven't addressed yet, that we still need to address. And it has to be a key part of the management of our forests.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Sorry, do you mind if I just toss one more question in there for you? The other thing that I meant to ask you about earlier, actually, was that, you know, for those people who are concerned or interested in protecting old growth, in saving what's left, especially the highest value endangered old growth that's left, one of the complicated realities we have to face is that many First Nations have tree farm licenses or woodlots that include old growth, and those nations actually rely on the revenue from their forestry operations, you know, and so it's an interesting question. What I'm curious to know is, what do you think is the way out of that situation for those of us who are interested in protecting old growth but want to do it in a way that is just and fair, and you know, it would be pretty hypocritical to go to First Nations and say, that's it, you can't log any more old growth, when settler logging companies have logged 97% of it. what's the way out of this situation? How do we save old growth in a way that is fair and just for First Nations, and that they're able to sustain their economies without logging old growth?
You know, that's a really tough question that each community, each First Nation is going to have to determine on their own. And of course, the problem is that not enough people go out to meetings when they make those decisions, or they don't want to go to those meetings because they get too controversial, and decisions might be made to cut the old growth with, you know, a handful of members, or not even 50% of the members. Because you're always going to have people in the communities that want to make money. And of course, old growth makes that money. And no matter how hard you try, people make those decisions. And I don't know how we can change that. I think that we just need to start educating our children on the importance of those forests and old growth and what we did and why we're doing that. The importance of sacred sites. I mean, we have to start, you know, for some people don't do some of the traditional practices anymore, so they don't feel, you know, that connection to the earth. And so, you know, this is an internal thing for our First Nations to be looking at. I once had a real fight in my community. They wanted to put a woodlot on a sacred mountain, and our elders have always said that if there's a sacred site on the mountain, the whole mountain needs to be protected. And I lost that. I was just crushed, because, you know, I worked closely with those elders, and I knew that, but there was nothing I could say in my community that would convince them to not do that. I mean, if I had been chief, I wouldn't even brought it to them, but that wasn't my choice, and so I was, you know, fighting from the outside. So I think it's an educational process to be talking to our communities about the importance of old growth on the landscape, on the ecosystems, what it is we're losing, and, you know, outside of the pressure of making money. You know, this is something you got to sit down and work out and talk about before you have to make the decision of whether to cut them. And yeah, but you know, you're always going to have, you know, some of those communities, and I think that's why, you know, if we have our own management systems in place, that we can make those decisions, or, you know, take 10% of the old growth. I don't know, you know, I mean, it's a really hard struggle to make those decisions.
One of the things that Ken Wu talked about was the need for, you know, financing for First Nations to support Indigenous businesses, so that they have other options, and that there's financing for those other options, other than just, you know, going in and you know, doing what they need to do to support their people economically. But I want to end on a more hopeful note. This is my last question for you, Dr. Sayers. Describe your most hopeful vision of the future. You know, what does that look like to you in terms of, you know, government and Indigenous relations, you know, in First Nations involvement in the economy, ecosystem management, whatever you want to talk about? Just give me your most hopeful, utopian vision of the future, and we'll end on that.
Well, I think that we need to have enough of our territories set aside for our use, that there are lands, totally, our resources, water included, water, air. We need to have that secure, and not just our reserve land base, which for Hupacasath is 0.001% of our traditional territory. That's just not acceptable. We have to have a large area set aside, and we have complete say over that, complete management over that, that we're able to do sustainable development. You know, and what we were just talking about, you know, if we had carbon credits, we wouldn't have to cut down those old growth trees. You know, we need to have those kinds of things in place, so that we can continue to use our territory the way we always have, you know, following the footsteps of our ancestors, that we can go out and use those sacred sites, because those are power places. You know, they bring power to you as an individual. The ability to continue to exercise our rights and, you know, go strip that cedar tree, go get those fish, go get those medicinal plants in a way that's going to be healthy. You know, like a lot of our plants out there are not healthy anymore because of the pollution. That, you know, we have a large role in restoring and rehabilitating our territory because it needs it, right? There's just been so much devastation to the land and to the water. And, you know, we need to have a role in doing that. And, you know, I think all of that takes partnerships and relationships and working together with people. Because, you know, some of us, you know, like Ken Wu and all the other people who are fighting and standing up for old growth, you know, we need those allies. We need people who understand us and who, you know, have their own desires. And I'm just hoping that, you know, this would happen, you know, fairly soon so that, you know, I don't have to keep fighting every single fight, and that my children are able to benefit from that, you know, that they can do the kind of economic development, that sustainable things that, you know, we love, clean energy or, you know, other things. I just, you know, be able to retain a way of life that's not threatened all the time. And so those are the kinds of things that I look for sure.
Dr. Judith Sayers, thank you so much for joining me on the Heartwood stream series today. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to spend some time with you, Daniel. Thank you.
All right, we're back. Oh yeah, this is supposed to be up here. Wonderful conversation with Dr. Judith Sayers, super insightful as always, very timely in the current context. Even though that interview was recorded last month, I think it's still very, very relevant, more so than ever. Just yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the implementation of the BC DRIPA law, DRIPA standing for Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that law is meant to bring all the rest of the laws in the province in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And of course, we've got a long, long way to go in that project. A lot of good words so far, but a lot of the same actions that we've seen for a long, long time. So hopefully with this new government, this new BC NDP government, that we start to see some more rapid positive changes implementing that DRIPA legislation. And of course, one of the very first things that the BC government could do in that spirit is in the context of the Nuchatlaht Nation's title case against the BC government, in which they are trying to get their land back, which was expropriated from them. This is on the northern half of Nuu-chah Island, and the BC government has been in court. Their lawyers have been pleading that the Nuchatlaht Nation abandoned their territory, which of course is not true. So probably one of the most immediate things that the BC government could do to show that it's serious about upholding the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is to stop pleading that Nuchatlaht abandoned their territory. And I'm going to show the video one more time that I showed at the beginning of the stream. And this is a video that I produced for the Nuchatlaht Nation to help with their fundraising. I will post the Nuchatlaht Land Back Fund page in the comments. And here is a new little video. It's just 2 minutes long that I produced for the Nuchatlaht Nation about this issue of the BC government pleading that Nuchatlaht abandoned their territory. The Nuchatlaht Nation is taking the BC government to court to assert their rightful ownership over their territory on Nuu-chah Island.
We've been here for thousands and thousands of years, and we've proudly owned it, and we proudly managed it.
But BC government lawyers have taken the absurd and disgraceful position in court that Nuchatlaht abandoned their territory.
The government of British Columbia, in the official pleadings in this case, say that they abandoned all that. They didn't abandon their territory. They were forced off their territory. Their land was expropriated without compensation. Their land was stolen from them. That's what happened.
This is an outrageous position being taken by the BC government that could violate its own legislation to uphold the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
It's not just a promise, it's a legislated mandate. It's required that every government official act in compliance with UNDRIP. And it's an appalling thing that the government of British Columbia still pleads abandonment.
Nuchatlaht is calling on Premier Horgan and his new cabinet to reverse this archaic and distasteful position of abandonment and chart a new course in its dealings with First Nations.
We're not just fighting for Nuchatlaht, but we want to show the world that we can manage better, we can enhance better, and there'll be enough for everybody.
The BC government has an opportunity to be on the right side of history and to show that it's serious about building a true nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples.
This is about a particular problem that we can solve. We can solve this problem. We can solve it now with this newly elected government. We can say, okay, do the right thing. Stop pleading abandonment. Do that. That's a good way to start.
All right, and that's all for today. Donate to the Nuchatlaht Land Back Fund. I'm going to put that link in the comments. I'm also going to put a letter writing tool in the comments that the Wilderness Committee is hosting to make it nice and easy for you to send a message to the BC government. There's a new cabinet that just got announced yesterday. Same Attorney General, David Eby. He'll be the one making this call. But new Indigenous Affairs Minister, Murray Rankin, will have some say in that conversation. And I think he gets it. I think he knows what's going on. So there's, it's a new start. It's a fresh start. The BC government has a chance to do something good. They have a chance to be on the right side of history here. And I hope they take it. I really do. But generally, governments don't do much unless they're forced. So send a message, send an email, make a phone call. These things do matter. They do the math. If so many people are calling or writing letters, they extrapolate that many, many more people must actually care about this, right? So, so send a message and share the video. Donate and help Nuchatlaht through their title fundraise for their title case. It's an expensive process, and what this title case will result in is not only more sovereignty, control, management, and stewardship and access for the Nuchatlaht people, but Nuchatlaht territory is actually one of the last bastions of old-growth temperate rainforests on the coast. Even though much of it has been logged and requires proper stewardship to bring it back, there's still a lot of really great old growth left in their territory, and we all need that. The whole planet needs that for the survival of the planet. We need to conserve what's left of our old growth so that it can keep storing carbon, keep conserving fresh water, and of course we should support Nuchatlaht because it is the right thing to do as well, but also will result in benefits for everyone. And the spirit of Nuchatlaht has always been one of generosity and sharing, and as Archie Little says himself, there will be enough for everyone. And that's always been one of the most inspiring messages of the Nuchatlaht people, is that this is not just for them. They're fighting for all First Nations and for all of us as well. So anyway, that's about all I have to say. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you again to Dr. Judith Sayers for talking to me last month, and I wanted to make sure that I rebroadcast that for all of you, this will live on the Facebook page as well in the video section, and I'll post the YouTube link once that's up. Please share this, subscribe or like my Facebook page, subscribe to the YouTube channel, share this with your friends, and tune in next time. I don't think I'm going to be doing many of these in December. We'll see. Maybe I'll do one more before the end of the year, but I got a lot of other stuff that I kind of want to work on, and but we'll definitely pick it up again in the new year. But yeah, keep an eye out for news and updates on the new webisodes for the Heartwood documentary. I'll be continuing to dig through all my footage for that, and I can't wait to share some more of that with you, like I did a couple weeks ago with the Stan Swinarchuk video, which is the most watched live stream that I've done on this channel so far. So thank you so much for checking that out. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out. It's a really it's a really breathtaking look at the boundary watershed around Grand Forks and the extensive logging that's led to years of flooding in the boundary country. So go back, check out those past episodes. There's some really great other conversations there. And yeah, see you next time on the Heartwood Stream Series. Take care.